On the 26th of March, 1812, an earthquake destroyed Caracas. Somewhere between 15 and 20,000 people died. Venezuela was, at that moment, in the middle of a war for independence from Spain, and not a country the United States had formally recognized. That spring, Congress passed a law, $50,000, to buy flour and ship it to the survivors. As far as the historical record shows, it was the first time the United States ever sent disaster relief to another country. 214 years later, it happened again on the same continent, and this time, Congress never voted at all. On Monday, the 10th of August, 2026, at 34 minutes past 7 in the morning, a magnitude 7.4 earthquake struck western Colombia. The epicenter was 5 kilometers south of San Jose del Palmar, in Choco, one of the least developed departments in the country. It was deep. The U.S. Geological Survey put it 110 kilometers down. Colombia's own geological service measured it shallower, closer to 96. Either way, deep. Hold on to that, because it explains a lot about what happened next. 10.5 million people felt strong shaking. Buildings came down in Cali, Pereira, Manizales, and Quibdó. Colombia declared a state of national disaster the same day. The death toll is in the hundreds, and as this is written, it is still moving. In the first 2 days alone, published figures range from 111 to more than 250. That is not sloppiness. Early counts arrive from hospitals, morgues, and local officials all at once, and reconciling them takes far longer than reporting them. The number of missing is harder still. Official channels and volunteer databases, where families enter their own relatives, have reported figures that differ by thousands. Neither is dishonest. They are counting different things, and the honest answer today is that nobody knows. Within hours of the quake, the United States announced $15.5 million. Congress did not vote on it. It did not have to, and the reason is a machine 2 centuries in the making. Colombia sits on the edge of a collision. The Nazca Plate, under the Pacific, is sliding beneath South America at about 5.5 centimeters a year. Most of the time that grinding happens along the boundary itself, the 2 plates lock together, then slipping. Those are the shallow ones. They are the ones that flatten coastlines and push tsunamis. This was not that. This earthquake happened inside the sinking plate, 60-odd miles straight down. That is a big part of why a 7.4 killed in the hundreds rather than the tens of thousands. That, and the fact that it happened under one of the most sparsely populated parts of the country. Depth spreads the energy out. It also spreads it wide, which is why a quake centered in a remote corner of Chaco was felt by 10.5 million people, and why there was no tsunami at all. None of this was a surprise. This coast has been doing it for as long as anyone has kept records. In 1906, an earthquake off the Colombia-Ecuador border became the strongest ever instrumentally recorded to affect Colombian territory. In 1979, Tumaco. In 1999, the Coffee region around Armenia, a magnitude 6 and roughly 1,200 people dead. And in 1983, Popayan, a magnitude 5.6, small as these things go, but shallow and directly under a colonial city. 267 people died. The year after Popayan, Colombia wrote its first national seismic building code. That is the pattern worth noticing, and we are going to see it again. A disaster happens, and afterwards, a law gets written. One aside, because someone always asks. Armero, 1985, 23,000 dead. That was not an earthquake. That was the Nevado del Ruiz volcano, and a mudflow that buried a town in the middle of the night. Different mechanism entirely. So, the United States sends $15.5 million overnight. Where does the authority to do that actually come from? Federal law, Title 22 of the U.S. Code, Section 2292. And the word it uses is the whole story. The president, quote, is authorized to furnish assistance to any foreign country. Authorized, not required. The statute creates a power, not a duty. Here is a detail almost everyone gets wrong, including me on the first pass. That provision is usually credited to the Foreign Assistance Act of 1961. It is not in it. The text was added in December 1975, and it sits under the 1961 laws number only because it amends it. The language has been stable ever since. But 1975 did not invent this. The institution came earlier. In 1964, a year after an earthquake leveled Skopje, and while a volcano was erupting in Costa Rica, when it became obvious that nobody in Washington was actually in charge of responding, a disaster, and then a law. The pattern again. And here is the part that complicates the tidy version. 6 weeks after that 1975 standing authority was signed, a catastrophic earthquake hit Guatemala. Congress had just built a permanent mechanism for exactly that, and then, 4 months after signing it, passed an entirely separate act for Guatemala anyway. $25 million, with $4 million of it earmarked for one highway. Standing authority did not end the old habit. Now, the machine as it exists today, which changed more recently than most reporting suggests. In early 2026, Congress folded the old international disaster account into a new one called International Humanitarian Assistance. It sits at the State Department, and it currently holds about $5.5 billion. The agency people still name for this work, USAID, was dismantled in 2025. Its disaster functions live at the State Department now. The teams that flew to Colombia are State Department teams. Now hold that against what happens when a disaster hits the United States. It runs almost exactly the other way around. A governor asks. That is the first step, and it is a formal request. Then federal and state officials go out and survey the damage together. Then, and only then, the president may declare a disaster. May. That word is doing the same work authorized was doing a minute ago. Once he does, FEMA can draw on the Disaster Relief Fund. There is one narrow exception. The president can declare an emergency without a governor asking, but only where the responsibility is primarily federal to begin with. It is written narrowly. So, compare the two. Abroad, the executive decides and money moves in hours. At home, a governor requests, damage is assessed, a declaration is signed, and then money moves. It is tempting to read that as one system being accountable and the other not. That is not what the difference is. Both accounts are funded by Congress in advance. Both carry over year to year. Congress does not vote disaster by disaster on either side. The difference is not oversight. It is a federal system. A governor's request exists because states are sovereign, and Washington does not walk into one uninvited. Which brings us to the number people actually argue about. In fiscal year 2025, Congress provided the Disaster Relief Fund, the domestic pot, with about $51.5 billion. The International Disaster Account that same year was funded at about $4.25 billion. Either way you cut it, the domestic pot is more than 10 times the foreign one. And step back further. All U.S. foreign aid, every country, every purpose, not just disasters, comes to roughly 1% of federal spending. For decades, Americans asked to estimate that figure have badly overestimated it, and not slightly. In poll after poll, the guess clusters around a quarter of the federal budget. It is one of the most consistently replicated findings in American public opinion. Those are the numbers. What you think about them is genuinely your business, and this channel is not going to tell you. But there is one thing people get factually wrong, and it is worth clearing up, because it is the thing everybody says. That $15.5 million could not have gone to FEMA instead. Not shouldn't have, could not. Two reasons. The first, when Congress appropriates money, federal law says it can only be spent on the purpose Congress named. There is no general authority to move money between those two accounts, and there never has been. The second is simpler. Federal disaster law defines who can receive that domestic money. The 50 states, the District of Columbia, Puerto Rico, the Virgin Islands, Guam, American Samoa, and the Northern Marianas. A foreign country is not in the category at all. The door is not closed. There is no door. Congress could build one tomorrow by writing a new law. For these two accounts, it never has. So, back to the beginning. Is there any law requiring the United States to send disaster aid anywhere? No. Not a statute, not a treaty. There is a set of non-binding international draft articles, and even those run the other direction. They say a country hit by a disaster shouldn't arbitrarily refuse help that is offered. Nothing obliges anyone to offer it. There is a fair objection to leaving it there, and it deserves saying. The discretion is at the front end. Once Congress appropriates money for a named disaster, the executive is supposed to spend it the way Congress said. The choice is in deciding to act at all. After that, at least in principle, the law tightens. 214 years ago, Congress had to pass an entire act of legislation to send flour to Caracas. Today it takes an afternoon because a long series of disasters convinced Washington to build the machine in advance. Whether that is the right amount of power to hand one office, that is a real question, and it doesn't have an answer in the statute. Should it be the president's call, or should Congress vote every time?